The morning began the way it always did for Emma Dalton, with a silence so soft it felt like the world had not fully woken. She stepped out of the small wooden cabin she shared with her brother, drawing in the cool air that clung to the early hour. The sky was still pale, the kind of washed-out gray that hinted the sun was coming, but had not yet found its way over the ridge. She held her shawl tightly around her shoulders, both for warmth and for comfort, because the day ahead carried a familiar heaviness. Behind her, through the thin wall of the cabin, she heard the sound that now defined her mornings, the uneven, shallow pull of her brother Ben's breathing. Each inhale came with a quiet strain, each exhale with a soft rasp, as though the simple act of drawing air cost him more than his fragile body could spare. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself with a slow breath. She had learned to greet each day with courage, but lately courage had begun to fray at the edges. She crossed the yard and made her way toward the schoolhouse. Her boots brushed against the dry earth, leaving prints that the wind would soon erase. The settlement was small, little more than a scattering of homes and a handful of buildings shaped by necessity rather than comfort. Life here was simple and hard, and Emma had grown used to the rhythm of tending to others while neglecting her own needs. The schoolhouse waited for her at the edge of the settlement, a single room of weathered wood. She let herself in, welcoming the faint scent of chalk and old paper. The room greeted her with its familiar quiet, the kind that wrapped around her gently. She placed her bag on the desk, rolled up her sleeves, and began preparing for the day. She dusted the benches, smoothed wrinkled pages of worn books, and wiped the chalkboard clean. These small tasks, repetitive as they were, had always soothed her. But this morning they failed to ease the nervous tension that had settled into her thoughts. She paused, letting her gaze drift to the window. The land stretched outward, wide and open, yet she felt confined, boxed in by responsibility, by fear, by the knowledge that every moment she spent away from the cabin was a moment Ben struggled without her. She reminded herself that she had no choice. Teaching was the only consistent work she had, and the only chance she had at supporting the two of them. The children arrived soon after, filling the room with chatter and laughter. Their presence brought warmth, though Emma found her smiles slipping more easily into worry whenever her mind wandered. She guided them through reading lessons, corrected mistakes gently, and encouraged their efforts with patience she barely felt. The younger ones stumbled over long words, the older ones concentrated with furrowed brows, and she moved between them, offering quiet reassurance. Yet even in the midst of their energy, a thread of unease tugged at her. She found herself listening, on instinct, for the echo of Ben's cough, though she knew she was miles away. She caught herself pressing her fingers against her lips more than once, trying to calm the tightness building in her chest. When the final lesson ended and the children scattered out the door, Emma remained seated for a moment, letting the silence settle again. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a breath she had held all morning. She needed strength, she reminded herself. Strength, and a way to endure another day of not knowing how much longer Ben's small body could fight against the sickness invading his lungs. She gathered her books and was preparing to leave when a movement outside the window caught her attention. A lone rider approached along the road, dust rising gently around the horse's hooves. It was unusual to see anyone coming toward the schoolhouse at this hour. Emma straightened, watching as the figure drew nearer. She recognized him when he dismounted, a formal, well-kept man she had seen only a few times in passing. Mr. Warren, a courier known for delivering official messages for families of higher standing. Emma stepped outside before he reached the door. He greeted her with a courteous nod. "Miss Dalton," he said, "I have something for you." He withdrew an envelope from the inside of his coat. It was neatly sealed with red wax, its surface unmarred, its weight unfamiliar in her hands. Emma accepted it, feeling a flicker of uncertainty. "Who sent this?" she asked quietly. "Someone who instructed me to deliver it directly," he replied. "And to you alone." His answer offered no clarity. She thanked him out of habit, though her words felt distant. He mounted his horse again and rode away, quickly shrinking into the horizon until only the soft dust lingered in his wake. Emma glanced down at the envelope, studying it carefully before she slipped it into her bag. She did not open it, not yet. Instead, she walked the path home with deliberate calm, her heart beating with a quiet anticipation she tried hard to suppress. Nothing about this day had prepared her for a letter addressed in such formality, and nothing in her life had ever involved couriers. When she reached the cabin, she found Ben awake, propped up on a thin pillow, his face pale and tired. "You're home," he murmured. Emma set her bag aside and knelt beside him, smoothing his blanket. "How was your day?" she asked gently. He shrugged, though the effort made him wince. "Just tired." She brushed hair from his forehead, hiding the worry rising in her eyes. "Rest now. I'll make tea." As she moved around the small kitchen space, heating water and stirring herbs into a cup, she felt the envelope's presence behind her like a question waiting to be asked. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on Ben, whose breaths had grown shallow again. After he drifted into a light sleep, she finally sat down at the table, removed the envelope from her bag, and held it under the lamplight. The wax seal looked imposing against the soft glow. She turned the envelope slowly, as though doing so would reveal its purpose without the need to open it. But no such answer came. She broke the seal with careful fingers and unfolded the letter inside. Her eyes moved across the neat strokes of ink, taking in every word. The message was brief, but it carried an unmistakable tone of importance. An invitation, a summons, and a promise that the matter concerned the future of both her and her brother. Emma reread the lines until they blurred slightly. She felt the air shift around her, as if the quiet cabin no longer held the same certainty it had only hours earlier. She pressed the letter flat against the table, tracing the signature with one trembling finger. Whatever this meant, it was something she could not ignore. She looked toward Ben's sleeping form, the small rise and fall of his chest fragile as a candle flame. Her decision was already forming, shaped by desperation, hope, and the burden she had carried alone for so long. Before she turned down the lamp, she held the letter once more, knowing that its arrival marked the end of the life she had known until now. And now, dear listeners, before we step further into Emma's journey and follow the path this unexpected letter will lead her along, tell me, where are you watching from today? Leave your city or country in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Emma folded the letter with a care that felt almost ceremonial, as though the paper itself held something fragile. She kept it close as she moved about the small cabin that evening, but her thoughts wandered far beyond the humble walls. She had lived long enough without unexpected news to forget how sharply the unknown could press against one's calm. Now that unfamiliar pressure followed her every motion. She prepared a modest meal for herself, though she barely tasted it. Her eyes drifted repeatedly toward the corner where the letter lay, its presence impossible to ignore even when Ben shifted in his sleep, drawing her attention in the way only he could. She rose to check on him several times, adjusting his blanket, cooling his forehead with a damp cloth. His breathing eased slightly each time she touched him, but nothing quieted the fear swirling inside her. Questions gathered in her mind in relentless circles. What matter could possibly tie her future to a man like Samuel Carter? Why mention Ben at all? She knew people in positions of power rarely involved themselves in the struggles of families like hers. She tried to dismiss the thought that the letter carried something dangerous, but uncertainty clung to her stubbornly. Later, as the night deepened, she sat by the window with the letter resting on her lap. The darkness outside was calm, dotted with stars that trembled faintly against the sky. She watched them, hoping their quiet glow might soothe her. Yet her heartbeat remained unsteady. The realization that she must go to the Carter ranch alone brought both dread and resolve. She had spent so many months fighting for Ben's health with dwindling means that even an uncertain summons felt like a path she could not refuse. Eventually, exhaustion overcame her. She drifted into a restless sleep, waking several times to the sound of Ben coughing, or to her own wandering thoughts. Morning arrived slowly, the faint light filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls until it touched her face and urged her awake. She rose before Ben stirred, quietly preparing for the day. She washed her face with cool water, braided her hair neatly, and chose the dress least worn by time, though its fabric still bore careful mending. She did not want to appear careless in front of someone whose world differed so sharply from hers. More than that, she wanted to show respect, if respect was what the letter demanded. As she adjusted the sleeves of her dress, she felt a flutter of doubt. She reached for the letter again, tracing its folds with her thumb. Nothing in its brief lines offered comfort, but she reminded herself that staying away would not change the truth that she and Ben needed help. Help she could no longer find on her own. Ben woke as she placed a cup of warm broth beside him. His eyes, though tired, lit up faintly at the sight of her. "You're leaving?" he asked in a quiet voice that carried more concern than strength. "Only for a few hours," she answered gently. "I'll be back before evening." "Yet, where are you going?" She hesitated, then gave him the safest truth she could. "Someone wrote to me about an opportunity. I need to find out what it is." He looked as though he wanted to say more, but instead offered a small nod. "Be careful," he whispered. "I will," she promised, brushing his cheek with the back of her hand. "Rest until I return." After ensuring he had water within reach and enough firewood by the stove, she stepped out into the cool morning air. The sky had brightened, and a faint breeze carried the scent of sage across the settlement. She drew in a deep breath, tightening her shawl as she began the long walk toward the Carter ranch. The road stretched ahead, unrolling like a ribbon of pale dust across the land. Emma followed it steadily, each step carrying her farther from the familiar and deeper into uncertainty. She passed sparse fences, a few wandering cattle, and the silhouettes of ranch hands riding in the distance. None paid her much attention, which allowed her thoughts to wander freely. As she walked, she found herself studying the horizon. The Carter lands stood far beyond the settlement, a vast expanse that reached toward the distant hills. She had seen the ranch from afar before, a broad property marked by fields, barns, and the grand house where its owner rarely emerged. It had always seemed like another world entirely, one she never expected to enter. Her pace slowed only once, when her breath caught unexpectedly at the sight of Ben's small wooden whistle lying in the pocket of her shawl. He had given it to her before she left, pressing it into her hand and telling her it would bring her luck. She closed her fingers around it, feeling the smoothness of the wood, and continued onward with renewed steadiness. After nearly an hour of walking, the landscape began to change. The fences grew taller and more orderly. Grass, though still sparse, appeared less wild and more tended. The air carried a faint hint of hay, mingled with the distant sounds of cattle. She followed the winding road until it crested a gentle rise, and then she saw it, the outer gate of the Carter Ranch. Two tall iron posts framed the entrance, their dark metal glinting faintly in the sunlight. A wide path led beyond them, bordered by neat rows of fencing and shaded by a scattering of old oak trees. The ranch house itself was not visible yet, but Emma could sense its presence deeper within the property, hidden behind distance and deliberate privacy. She stopped a few paces from the gate. The sudden stillness around her made her feel as though the moment itself had paused, waiting for her to gather enough courage to step forward. Her pulse thudded softly at her neck. She looked down at her hands, surprised to see how tightly she was gripping the strap of her bag. For a long moment she simply stood there, letting the weight of the place settle over her. The air held a strange tension, neither welcoming nor hostile, but undeniably expectant. She took in the quiet, the distant sound of wind moving through the trees, the faint creak of metal in the gate's hinges. Whatever awaited her inside belonged to a world she had never touched. And yet she was here, at its threshold, because she could no longer ignore the faint but insistent tug of hope. Hope that somehow, in some impossible way, this visit might offer a chance for Ben to recover, or at least for her to learn of a path she had not yet considered. She inhaled slowly, steadying her breath. Then she stepped closer to the gate, resting her hand lightly on its cold surface. Her journey toward the unknown had truly begun. Emma stood before the iron gate only a moment longer before she became aware of quiet footsteps approaching from inside the property. A man emerged from behind the nearby fence line, dressed in a dark vest and worn work boots, his posture attentive but not unkind. He paused when he saw her, then offered a polite nod. "Are you Miss Dalton?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was told to expect you. This way, please." He opened the gate with a slow pull that released a faint groan of metal. Emma stepped through, feeling a strange tightening in her chest as the entrance closed behind her. She followed the man along the wide dirt path, her boots brushing against small stones as she walked. The ranch stretched outward on both sides, broad pastures, distant barns, and occasional figures moving among the livestock. Everything was organized with quiet precision, as though nothing here was left to chance. The path curved gently, leading to a cluster of buildings set near a rise in the land. The main house stood at the center, tall enough to cast generous shade across the yard. Its wooden exterior bore signs of age, yet held itself with dignity, the windows framed by neatly maintained shutters. Emma found herself slowing despite her best efforts, observing details she had never imagined seeing so closely. The man guiding her glanced back. "Mr. Carter is expecting you in his study. I'll take you inside." Emma nodded, her hands curling slightly around the handle of her bag. When they reached the porch steps, she wiped her palms discreetly against her skirt, trying to ease her nerves. The front door opened with a muted creak that revealed a hallway lined with framed sketches and shelves holding weathered books. The air inside felt cooler and carried a faint scent of wood polish and dried herbs. "Right this way," the man said. He led her down the long corridor until they reached a pair of heavy doors. He knocked once, listened for a response, then stepped at it. "You may go in." Emma swallowed her apprehension and entered the study. The room was quiet and spacious, with tall bookshelves rising along the walls and a single window allowing afternoon light to fall across the floor. Papers lay neatly arranged on a large desk near the center. A fireplace occupied one corner, its embers still faintly warm, though no flame remained. Several chairs stood near the walls, and the entire space held an air of purposeful silence. Emma stepped further inside, noticing a chair positioned opposite the desk. She hesitated only a moment before taking the seat. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her skirt as she glanced around the room again, absorbing the stillness. A few minutes passed before the door opened behind her. She turned, and her breath caught, not from fear but from the unexpected gravity the man carried with him. Samuel Carter stepped inside with a measured pace, closing the door quietly before moving toward the desk. He was taller than she imagined, though his posture bore a subtle bend, as if burdened by something far heavier than age. His hair was dark, but lightly threaded with silver, and his jawline, though strong, carried the shadow of fatigue. A faint tension hovered around his eyes, suggesting long nights without rest. "Miss Dalton," he said, his voice steady but low. "Thank you for coming." She rose quickly from her seat. "Mr. Carter." He motioned gently for her to sit again before lowering himself into the chair behind the desk. For a brief moment, he seemed to gather his strength, placing a hand upon the armrest as though grounding himself. "I trust the journey was manageable," he said. "Yes," Emma replied. "Thank you." Samuel inclined his head slightly, studying her with an expression that revealed nothing. His gaze was neither warm nor cold, merely observant, as though he were weighing something he had long considered but had not yet decided how to voice. Emma found herself looking away, suddenly aware of how the simplicity of her appearance contrasted sharply with the order and structure of the room. Yet she reminded herself that she had come because the letter demanded her presence, not because she sought approval. "I imagine," Samuel began, "that receiving a letter from me was unexpected." "It was," she admitted. He nodded once, leaning back in his chair. "I do not send many, and rarely to those outside my business affairs, but in your case I felt the matter required direct communication." Emma waited, unsure whether she should speak or allow him to continue. She clasped her hands lightly in her lap, sensing the weight of every passing second. Samuel drew a slow breath. "I have learned about your circumstances, not by prying, but through the natural conversations that circulate in small communities. People speak with concern for your brother. They admire your dedication to him." Emma stiffened slightly, surprised that her struggles had reached someone like him. She had always assumed her difficulties formed a small, private world few cared to notice. "I mention this," he continued, "so you understand that your presence here is not an accident. I requested to see you because the situation you face intersects with something I must settle." His words held a formality that masked something deeper, a seriousness that made Emma lean forward slightly, her pulse quickening. She tried to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the quiet restraint in his tone, but his thoughts remained hidden behind a controlled calm. "I would like to speak plainly," Samuel said at last. "But before I do, I need to know whether you are comfortable and whether you are prepared to discuss a matter of significant consequence." Emma met his gaze, finding it steady yet shadowed by something she could not name. She felt both drawn and wary, uncertain where the conversation was leading but unable to step away now that she sat before him. "I can listen," she said softly. Samuel exhaled, not with relief, but as though steadying himself. "Good, then we will proceed carefully." He paused, then lifted a folder from the desk, though he did not open it. Instead, he rested his hand on its cover, tapping the edge lightly with his thumb. "There are details I will explain," he said, "but not all at once. This first conversation is meant to give context, not decisions." Emma nodded. The quiet around them thickened, not with tension but with anticipation. Samuel's eyes softened slightly, not with warmth, but with honesty. "Before anything else," he said, "you deserve to understand why you are here." And with that, the room settled into a deeper stillness, as though every object within it leaned closer, waiting for the truth that had yet to be spoken. Samuel remained still for a moment, his fingers resting on the folder before him, as if he needed the steadiness of its surface. The air between them felt suspended, holding the weight of words yet to be spoken. Emma kept her posture composed despite the anxious rhythm of her heartbeat. She sensed that whatever came next would reach far beyond a simple explanation. When Samuel lifted his gaze to hers, the lines of fatigue around his eyes appeared more pronounced. There was no harshness in his expression, only a gravity that suggested he had rehearsed this conversation many times in silence. "Miss Dalton," he began, "I will not waste your time with courtesies. The matter I must share with you is not one I speak of easily, nor one that concerns many people, but it concerns you now, and you deserve to hear it plainly." Emma inclined her head, her palms resting lightly against her skirt. He drew a slow breath, as though preparing himself. "My health has been declining for some time," he said. "I have consulted physicians here and in the next county. Their conclusions are the same. My condition will not improve." Emma felt an instinctive jolt of sympathy pierce through her. She did not speak, but her eyes softened, inviting him to continue. You may have heard speculation, Samuel added. People talk, especially when they know little. Some assume I carry wounds from the war. Others believe I have withdrawn by choice. The truth is simpler and less convenient. My illness is of the kind that takes strength in quiet increments. It does not announce itself loudly, but it advances without mercy. A faint tremor passed through his left hand. He pressed it against the armrest as though steadying himself. The doctors estimate I have a year, he continued. Perhaps less. It is difficult to measure such things with precision. The room seemed to tighten around them, as if the very walls recognized the weight of his confession. Emma's breath became shallow, taken aback by the stark finality of his tone. She had known suffering through Ben, but hearing a man speak of his own approaching end with such calm stirred a deep ache in her chest. I tell you this, Samuel said, because the rest cannot be understood without it. He released the folder and leaned back slightly, though his posture remained guarded. When I am gone, my estate will not pass into gentle hands. My nearest relative is a man whose interest lies in profit without responsibility. He views this land not as a home or livelihood for those who work it, but as a resource to exploit. If ownership falls to him, many who depend on this ranch will suffer and everything built here will be undone. Emma nodded slowly, beginning to grasp the emerging shape of his dilemma. Years ago, Samuel continued, I had both a wife and a child. Ktpum. They would have been my natural heirs, but fate took them from me in a single day. His voice thinned slightly, though he did not lower it. The law is clear. Without an heir born in lawful marriage, my estate passes to the next of kin. That is the man I spoke of. He cannot inherit while I am alive, but the moment I am gone, he will claim everything. Emma felt her pulse rise again. A faint unease began to flicker in her stomach, though she did not yet understand why. Samuel folded his hands on the desk. Though his movements were controlled, each seemed to require more effort than a healthy man would need. I have considered every legal avenue, he said. I have searched for distant relations, reviewed old documents, examined every clause available. There is only one way to prevent the estate from falling into destructive hands. He paused, letting the quiet settle heavily between them. I must have a lawful wife, he said finally, and a child born within that marriage. Only then can the estate pass securely to someone I choose. The room grew very still. Emma felt something cold sweep through her, though she kept her expression composed. She understood the enormity of his words, yet waited for him to speak them fully. Samuel did not avert his gaze. I have not summoned you to offer charity, he said. I summoned you because you possess qualities I believe essential for what must be done. Strength, integrity, and the capacity to protect someone vulnerable. Her heart pounded so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. And so, Samuel continued quietly, I am asking you to consider something that will sound impossible at first. He straightened slightly as though anchoring himself to the moment. I am asking you, he said, to become my wife. The world seemed to tilt. Emma did not move, did not blink. Her breath caught in her throat so sharply she almost reached for the edge of her chair. Samuel's expression remained steady, but behind his composure lay a sadness that deepened the ache within her. This is not a romantic sentiment, he said. I will not pretend it is. I am offering you a marriage of necessity, a contract, if you will. In return, I will ensure your brother receives full medical care. I will secure your livelihood. You will never want for shelter, food, or protection. Emma found her voice at last, though it emerged faintly. You want me to bear a child? Yes, he said with quiet honesty. It must be so. Without an heir, all else fails. A dizzying rush of emotion surged through her. Shock, humiliation, disbelief, fear. She looked down at her hands, struggling to steady herself. She felt as though she had been struck by something invisible, something far too heavy for her small frame. Samuel seemed to sense her turmoil. I know what I ask is extraordinary, he said, and I do not expect an answer today. I ask only that you consider what this could mean for you and for Ben. The mention of her brother cut through her fog like a blade. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to draw breath. When I say I will care for him, Samuel added, I mean entirely. Every treatment, every medicine, every need, he will want for nothing. Emma lifted her gaze slowly. Why me? She whispered. Because you would protect a child, Samuel replied, even if that child were not yet born, and because you understand hardship without bitterness. Such a mother leaves a legacy worth preserving. The compliment struck her unexpectedly. adding another layer to the confusion clouding her thoughts. "You may leave whenever you wish," Samuel said gently. "Take time to think. The decision is yours alone." Emma rose slowly from her chair, her legs unsteady beneath her. The room no longer felt spacious. It felt too full, too heavy with implications she could not immediately grasp. She clutched the strap of her bag as though it might hold her upright. "I need time," she murmured. "Of course." She turned toward the door, each step feeling strangely distant from the last. When she reached the corridor, she pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm the frantic rhythm of her heartbeat. Nothing in her life had prepared her for this. Nothing at all. The walk back to the settlement felt longer than it had that morning. Emma kept her gaze fixed on the path ahead, but the words Samuel had spoken echoed through her mind in unbroken lines. The quiet land around her seemed unchanged. Yet she felt as though she had crossed into a world where every choice now carried extraordinary weight. The cabin appeared at last, small as ever, but now it felt impossibly fragile in her eyes. When she stepped inside, she found Ben asleep, curled beneath his blanket. His breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of his chest alarmingly faint. Emma set her bag aside and knelt beside him, brushing her fingers along his cheek. His skin was warm, warmer than it should have been. She remained there longer than she intended, listening to the uneven rhythm of his breath until it steadied enough for her to move. Only then did she sit by the table, placing both hands flat on its surface, in an attempt to anchor herself. The room felt too small, and her thoughts too vast. She replayed every detail of the conversation, the calmness in Samuel's voice, the bleak certainty in his confession, the stark finality of his request. She had walked into the ranch not knowing what to expect. Never had she imagined leaving with a proposal that reshaped the very boundaries of her life. The hours slipped past quietly. She prepared a simple meal, though she barely tasted any of it. When Ben woke, she fed him spoonful by spoonful, offering a smile she could not maintain for long. He tried to ask where she had gone, but his voice was weak, and she gently redirected him toward rest. That night, after Ben fell asleep again, Emma sat alone beside the window, watching the moon climb slowly above the treetops. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and whispered to herself, as though voicing her thoughts might help her understand them better. Marriage to Samuel meant stepping into a life she had never dreamed of. It meant carrying a child born of necessity, not love. It meant entering a house shaped by grief and shadowed by the short future of its master. But refusing him meant surrendering Ben to a struggle she could no longer fight. Her hands curled into fists as memories surfaced. Ben laughing beneath the summer sun, running through the grass with a wooden toy she had carved. Ben clutching her hand the night he first fell ill. Ben trying to hide his exhaustion so she would not worry. She could not imagine a world where she failed him. Sleep came fitfully. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Samuel's solemn face, heard the measured tone with which he uttered the words, "I am asking you to become my wife." She drifted between dreams and waking, unable to escape the weight of the decision before her. The next morning offered no clarity. She woke early, made tea for Ben, and tidied the cabin, all while her mind remained tangled in quiet turmoil. She tried to push away the memory of Samuel's certainty, but it clung to her, insistent and unyielding. By midday, Ben's fever had risen sharply. His forehead burned under her touch, and the tremor in his hands frightened her more than she could admit. She fetched water, cooled his skin, whispered soothing words, but his breaths grew shorter and more desperate. "Emma," he rasped, reaching blindly. "I'm here," she answered, choking on the tightness in her throat. "I don't want to make you worry." Her heart constricted painfully. "You're not," she lied softly. "You're just tired. Rest for a little while." But when she stepped away to prepare fresh cloths, she paused, gripping the edge of the table as her knees threatened to give way. Ben's illness had worsened so quickly. The medicines she could afford were no longer enough. She had hoped to keep him safe with her own strength, but that strength was no match for the disease slowly stealing his breath. She felt something inside her collapse, not with sound, but with the quiet inevitability of truth. She could not save Ben alone. That realization left her shaken, standing in the center of the cabin, as though the ground beneath her had shifted. She pressed both palms to her face, trying to contain the rising wave of fear. The world felt suddenly too still, too quiet, as though waiting for her to accept what she had avoided for so long. She needed help only Samuel Carter had the means to provide. The day passed in a haze. Emma tended to Ben with greater urgency, counting the seconds between his breaths, feeling panic tighten each time his lungs struggled. Every moment solidified the choice she had been trying not to make. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, she sat at the table with a sheet of paper before her. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pencil. She stared at the blank page for a long time. The words she wrote were simple, nearly too simple for the enormity of what they signified. Mr. Carter, I would like to speak with you again. Emma Dalton. She held the note in her hand afterward, unable to release it. Her chest felt heavy with dread, relief, and something else she could not yet name. Finally, with a quiet exhale, she folded the paper and slipped it into an envelope. The walk to town was short, but each step carried the weight of a future she had never imagined. She delivered the letter to the courier's office and returned home with her thoughts swirling, too tangled to separate. When she reached the cabin, she found Ben sleeping at last, though his rest remained fragile. She knelt beside him and brushed his hair gently away from his face. "Forgive me," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what part of her decision required forgiveness, her fear, her hope, or the surrender of a dream she had never dared to name. She lay awake long after the moon rose high in the sky, listening to Ben's faint breathing, and clutching the knowledge that she had stepped onto a path from which there would be no turning back. And yet, beneath her fear, a quiet steadiness began to form, a fragile understanding that she had chosen the only path that protected the person she loved most. The reply came sooner than Emma expected. The courier arrived early the next morning while the light was still pale and the settlement had not yet fully woken. Emma opened the door to find him holding a sealed envelope, his expression neutral, though his tone carried a trace of formality. "From Mr. Carter," he said. Emma thanked him and closed the door with careful hands. She stood for a moment in the center of the room, the envelope resting untouched in her palm. Ben watched her from his cot, his expression still drowsy from sleep but filled with quiet concern. "Is it about the opportunity you mentioned?" he asked. Emma forced a small nod. She waited until he sipped the warm tea she prepared for him, then stepped aside to open the letter. The message was brief. "Miss Dalton, if you wish to discuss matters further, I request your presence at noon. I will make the necessary arrangements. Samuel Carter." The simplicity of the words steadied her more than she expected. There was no insistence, no pressure, only a clear next step. She prepared herself as she had 2 days earlier, though her hands shook slightly as she braided her hair. When she arrived at the ranch, Samuel met her in the same study where they had first spoken. His posture was more reserved this time, as though he understood the weight she carried. "Miss Dalton," he said quietly, "have you come to a decision?" Emma clasped her hands, grounding herself in the truth she had reached during those long hours of fear and hope. "Yes," she answered. "I will accept what you asked." Samuel lowered his gaze briefly, not in triumph, but in solemn acknowledgement. "Then we will proceed without delay," he said. "Given my condition, it is best we formalize matters soon. I will arrange for a ceremony today." Her breath caught. "Today?" "Yes," he replied. "There is no benefit in postponing what must be done, but if you wish more time—" "No," she interrupted softly. "I understand." He nodded once, then stepped aside to speak with one of the household staff. Within the hour, arrangements were underway. By midday, a small gathering, a minister, 2 witnesses, and the household manager, stood in the modest chapel at the edge of the ranch. Emma wore her best dress, though it looked plain under the chapel's muted light. Samuel wore a dark coat, buttoned neatly despite the fatigue evident in his shoulders. The ceremony moved forward with quiet efficiency. There were no flowers, no music, no guests beyond those required to sign their names. The minister's voice echoed gently through the small room, shaping vows that felt too heavy for Emma's trembling voice. When the moment came to exchange rings, Samuel slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. His hand was warm, though his touch was steady enough to calm her shaking. She placed his ring just as carefully, noting the faint tremor in his fingertips. "You may seal your union," the minister said. Neither reached forward to embrace. They merely exchanged a respectful nod, 2 people bound not by affection, but by necessity, and the fragile thread of trust stretched between them. After signing the marriage register, Samuel extended his arm in a gesture of courtesy. "Shall we go inside?" he asked. Emma took his arm, though she felt more like a companion than a wife. The walk back to the main house was quiet. The ranch hands continued their work in the distance. The world remained indifferent to the change that had upended her life. Inside the house, Emma was shown to a room prepared specifically for her. The space was larger than she expected. A neatly made bed, a small writing desk, a wardrobe, and a window overlooking the pasture. She traced her fingers along the smooth wooden edge of the dresser, feeling how foreign everything seemed. A knock sounded. Samuel stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Dinner will be served soon," he said. "If you need anything, inform Mrs. Lorne. She manages the household." "Thank you," Emma replied. He hesitated a moment, then added gently, "I know this day has been difficult for you. I hope the transition will not weigh heavily." She offered a faint smile, though her heart felt far heavier than she could express. "I appreciate the consideration." Dinner took place in a dining room too large for 2 people. The table stretched farther than necessary, but only 2 settings had been placed, one at the head and one at Samuel's left. Emma took her seat quietly, folding her hands in her lap. The servants moved soundlessly, bringing plates of warm food she barely touched. Samuel attempted polite conversation, asking if she had been comfortable since her arrival, if she required anything for Ben, if there was any concern she wished to share. His voice remained courteous, but a subtle distance lingered in his posture. Emma answered softly, grateful for his gentleness, but unable to dispel the unfamiliarity pressing in around her. After the meal, Samuel rose. "I will be in my study," he said. "Should you need anything, you may send for me." Emma nodded, watching him leave. She remained seated for a moment, staring at the empty chair across from hers. Then she returned to her room, where the quiet swallowed her fully. The hours passed, uncomfortably slowly. She unpacked her few belongings, folded dresses, a worn book, the wooden whistle Ben had made for her. Placing it on the bedside table brought a brief warmth to her chest, though it faded quickly under the weight of the reality she now inhabited. Later, a soft knock announced Samuel's return. "I wanted to speak with you before the night ends," he said. She stepped aside to let him in. He remained near the doorway, his posture tense in a way she had not seen before. "What I ask of you," he began, "is something that must be approached with respect and caution. Tonight, I will not insist on anything. You have endured enough change for one day." Emma felt a mix of relief and confusion. "I appreciate that," she whispered. "I only ask," he continued, "that we begin this part of our agreement with dignity. When the time comes to fulfill what is required, I promise to be considerate." His sincerity surprised her. She nodded. Her voice caught somewhere between fear and gratitude. He stepped back, offering her the gentlest bow she had ever seen from him. "Rest well, Mrs. Carter." When he left, she stood alone in the silent room, staring at the closed door. She moved to the bed, sitting on its edge, feeling its softness beneath her hands. The house felt immense, too large for a heart beating as unevenly as hers. She lay down at last, though sleep did not come easily. The night stretched long, each minute bringing her deeper into the life she had chosen, a life shaped by duty, shadowed by uncertainty, and bound to a man whose world she at once respected and feared. And still, as she curled beneath the heavy quilt, one thought anchored itself gently in her chest. She had done all this for Ben. The rest, she would learn to face. The early weeks of Emma's life at the Carter Ranch unfolded with a quiet strangeness that settled into her bones. Each day carried a familiar pattern: meals prepared with care, chores managed by the household staff, the distant hum of work in the pastures. But none of it felt like hers. She moved through the halls of the great house like someone trying not to disturb a place that had existed long before her arrival. Her room, though comfortable, felt too orderly compared to the modest cabin where she had lived with Ben. She missed the gentle clutter of their shared life, the faint warmth of a kettle always simmering, the small noises that had filled silence with meaning. Here, the silence was larger, echoing softly against the wooden floors and tall ceilings. Samuel remained courteous but distant. He met her at breakfast and dinner, offering polite conversation, yet his words carried a reserved formality that never ventured into anything personal. It was clear he did not intend to overwhelm her with expectations, but the gap between them stretched wider than the dining table they sat at each night. She spent her mornings learning the layout of the house. Mrs. Lorne walked with her through storerooms, kitchens, and the garden paths, explaining the routines that kept the ranch functioning. Emma listened carefully, trying to memorize every detail, though she often felt as though she were memorizing the structure of a world she still stood outside of. In the afternoons, she visited Ben whenever she could. Samuel had already arranged for improved care and medicine, and though her brother remained fragile, the certainty that his needs were no longer restricted by scarcity allowed Emma to breathe more easily. The knowledge that her sacrifice had given him a chance brought her strength, even on the days when loneliness pressed in more heavily. One evening, about 2 weeks after the wedding, Emma noticed that Samuel moved more slowly than usual. His steps were measured, and when he lifted his wine glass at dinner, she saw the faintest tremor in his hand. He tried to mask it behind a calm expression, but Emma recognized the signs of someone fighting a quiet battle with his own body. After the meal, she lingered at the table as the servants cleared the dishes. Samuel offered a brief nod before excusing himself and heading toward his study. She watched him walk away, his shoulders drawn slightly inward, as if bracing himself against something unseen. Later that night, Emma was sorting through a few of her belongings when she heard a soft, muffled sound from down the hall. It was faint at first, barely a hint of distress, but enough to pull her attention sharply. She stepped into the hallway and listened. The noise came again, a low cough, strained and painful. Without giving herself time to think, she followed the sound to Samuel's study. The door was ajar, and through the small opening she saw him leaning against the edge of his desk, one hand pressed to his chest, the other gripping the chair for balance. "Mr. Carter?" she said softly. He stiffened slightly but did not turn. "Forgive me," he murmured, his voice uneven. "I wasn't aware anyone was nearby." Emma stepped inside, her concern outweighing her hesitation. "Are you unwell?" Samuel tried to straighten, but another breath escaped him in a shaky exhale. "It's only a passing spell. It happens now and then." The tightness in his expression contradicted his calm tone. Emma moved closer, noting the pallor beneath his skin, the strain around his eyes. "Sit," she said gently. "Please." He hesitated, clearly unused to receiving care. But the weakness in his legs made the choice for him. He lowered himself into the chair, his breath unsteady. Emma poured a glass of water from the pitcher on the desk and offered it to him. He accepted it, though his fingers trembled when they brushed hers. She waited until he took a few slow sips. When some color returned to his face, he rested the glass on the desk with deliberate care. "You need not worry," he said quietly. "I acknowledge my illness, but it still surprises me in moments like these." Emma remained beside him, her hands lightly clasped. "If you're in pain, you shouldn't bear it alone." His eyes lifted to hers, eyes shadowed yet oddly clear in their honesty. "I did not intend for you to see this side of me. I live here now," she replied. "You needn't hide from me." His gaze lingered on her, the air between them shifting subtly. For the first time she felt he truly saw her, not as someone bound to him by agreement, but as another soul sharing the same fragile space. "Thank you," he said softly, the words simple yet filled with something deeper. Emma fetched a cloth, dampened it with cool water from the wash basin nearby, and pressed it gently against his forehead. Samuel closed his eyes, allowing her touch without resistance. His breathing eased slowly. She stayed with him until the tension in his posture softened and the trembling in his hands subsided. When he finally opened his eyes, they held a quiet gratitude she had not seen before. "You should rest," she said. He offered a faint smile, one touched with sadness. "I will, and I apologize for troubling you." "You didn't," she answered. He rose carefully, and Emma walked with him to the door of his room. Before stepping inside, he paused. "Emma," he said, his voice low, "this house has long been a place of solitude. Your presence softens it." The words lingered in the quiet that followed. Emma looked down, unsure how to respond, her heart caught between sympathy and fear. "Good night," she whispered. "Good night," he replied, then disappeared behind the door. From that night forward, something shifted between them, not dramatically, but in small, undeniable ways. Samuel began to seek her company during brief moments of rest, and Emma found herself drawn to the quiet strength he tried so hard to maintain. Their interactions remained careful, but the distance no longer felt insurmountable. On days when his illness pressed harder, Emma sat with him in the study, reading aloud from books she found on the shelves. And when he asked her thoughts on matters of the ranch, she answered with growing confidence, surprised by how closely he listened. The nights when he suffered the most continued to trouble her. He never called for her, yet somehow she always sensed the shift in the air, the muffled cough, the uneven breathing, the faint thud of a chair against the floor. Each time she went to him without hesitation, and each time he accepted her help with quiet humility. Their connection, though fragile, began to take shape, not from affection or desire, but from two people learning to navigate the shadows that bound them together. And slowly the unfamiliar corridors of the house began to feel less daunting, as though some small warmth had begun to seep into spaces that had long been cold. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that felt more natural than anything Emma had known since arriving at the ranch. Though she still moved carefully through the unfamiliar corridors and still felt the weight of the arrangement that had brought her here, she no longer carried the loneliness that had shadowed her first days. Samuel's quiet acceptance of her presence and the trust growing between them softened the harsh edges of her new life. She spent mornings learning more about the operations of the ranch. Samuel, when his strength allowed, introduced her to the household ledgers and explained the responsibilities she would one day need to manage. He spoke with the same calm directness he always had. But something gentler threaded through his tone now, an acknowledgement of the bond forming between them, delicate though it still was. Some afternoons they sat together in the study, Emma reading aloud while Samuel listened with a relaxed posture that made him appear almost peaceful. The sound of her voice filled the room in a way that made the walls feel less imposing. On days when his health faltered, she remained close, watching carefully for signs that his breath or strength was slipping. Yet even in the midst of this strange companionship, Emma felt an increasing weariness in her own body. It began subtly, a lightheadedness when she stood too quickly, a faint exhaustion that clung to her even after a full night's rest. She dismissed it at first, attributing it to the pressures she had shouldered for so long. But one morning, as she walked along the narrow garden path beside the house, the world tilted suddenly. The ground rose toward her in a blur of color and light. She reached out to steady herself, but her vision narrowed, and her knees buckled before she could catch hold of anything. The last thing she felt was the cool brush of wind against her cheek. When Emma opened her eyes, she found herself lying on a sofa in the parlor. A soft blanket covered her legs, and the faint smell of lavender lingered in the air. She blinked slowly, trying to piece together what had happened. "Stay still," a calm voice instructed. She turned her head slightly and saw Dr. Hale, the physician who occasionally visited the ranch. He sat beside her, his expression composed but attentive. Samuel stood nearby, his posture rigid, his face drawn with concern she had never seen so openly displayed. "What happened?" Emma whispered, attempting to sit up. "You fainted," Dr. Hale replied gently. "I believe your body was telling you to rest." Samuel stepped closer. "You fell," he said, his voice quiet yet strained. "You frightened us." Emma lowered her gaze, suddenly aware of her weakness. "I'm sorry." "There is nothing to apologize for," Samuel said, his tone firm enough to leave no room for argument. Dr. Hale began a careful examination, asking her questions about her recent health, taking her pulse, and checking her temperature. He worked with a reassuring patience, though she sensed a more serious focus beneath his calm exterior. After a few moments, he sat back and folded his hands thoughtfully. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I want you to hear this without alarm. What you are experiencing is not an illness." Emma frowned, confused. "Then what?" He offered a small, warm smile. "You are with child." For a moment the room fell away. Emma stared at him in stillness, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and sudden clarity. She felt as though a quiet shift had taken place deep within her, something delicate yet profound. "A child," she repeated softly. "Yes," Dr. Hale said. "You must rest more than you have. Your body needs strength, and stress will not help. But as far as I can tell, everything appears normal." Emma's hand drifted to her abdomen, though she felt nothing but the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. The reality of the doctor's words washed over her slowly. She carried the heir Samuel needed, the child she had agreed to bear, the life that might secure her brother's future. She looked toward Samuel. He had gone utterly still. For a long moment he did not speak, his eyes lowered to her abdomen, then lifted to meet her gaze. Something broke open within his expression, not sorrow, not fear, but a vulnerable wonder she had not expected from a man who guarded his emotions so carefully. He moved as if pulled by instinct and knelt beside the sofa. His hand hovered uncertainly, then rested lightly over hers. "You carry our child," he said. Voice roughened by emotion he made no effort to hide. Emma felt her throat tighten. "Yes." His fingers trembled slightly where they touched hers. "I never thought," he murmured, "that my life would allow such a blessing again." Dr. Hale rose discreetly. "I'll leave you both for a moment," he said, quietly gathering his instruments before stepping into the hall. Samuel remained kneeling. He looked down again, his expression fragile with a mixture of gratitude and longing. "I know this arrangement began with necessity," he said, "but this is something more than I allowed myself to hope for." Emma swallowed, unsure how to respond. She had expected many things when she came to the ranch, but not this tenderness, not this humbled gratitude in his voice. Samuel straightened slowly but did not release her hand. "From this moment forward," he said, "you will not lift anything heavy. You will rest when your body asks, and you will have whatever you need." "Samuel," she began, startled by the sudden intensity in his words. "No," he interrupted gently. "This is no longer only duty. You carry a future I will not live to guide. I must ensure the path ahead is safe, for both of you." His sincerity touched her deeply. She felt a warmth rise within her chest, fragile yet steady. In the days that followed, Samuel's behavior shifted noticeably. He accompanied her on short walks when he had the strength, adjusting his pace to match hers. He asked after her comfort more frequently, ensuring she never felt cold or fatigued. The staff, at his request, prepared meals rich in nourishment, and whenever he saw her touch her abdomen unconsciously, a faint, reverent smile crossed his face. In the evenings, when his illness forced him to rest more often, he invited her into the study where they sat together by the unlit fireplace. He showed her documents she would one day need to understand. contracts, maps, lists of employees, explaining them with patience. He was preparing her, she realized, not out of obligation, but out of a growing trust that softened him in ways she had never imagined possible. Though his health waned quietly, his resolve grew stronger. He devoted himself to securing their future with a steadiness that humbled her. And Emma, feeling the small life growing within her, found herself returning his efforts with a gentleness that came not from duty, but from a deepening compassion she could no longer deny. One night, as she rose to leave the study, he stopped her with a single request. "Stay a moment longer," he said softly. "Your presence eases the weight I carry." Emma sat beside him again, and the silence they shared was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. The day the storm arrived began like any other. The sky held a muted glow as Emma sat near the window, mending a small tear in one of Samuel's shirts. Her sewing was steady, though her thoughts drifted often to the gentle flutter beneath her ribs, a quiet reminder that life was growing inside her. Each time she felt that faint motion, a soft warmth spread across her chest. Samuel rested in the adjacent chair, reviewing a ledger with a furrowed brow. He had grown paler in recent weeks, the hollows beneath his cheekbones deepening, but he tried to hide the progression of his illness behind a calm determination. Though his breath came shorter than before, he greeted every new day with a quiet resolve that both comforted and saddened her. "Are you tiring yourself?" he asked, glancing at her over the rim of his glasses. "No," Emma replied. "I'm all right." He nodded, though she sensed he was not fully convinced. He had grown increasingly protective since learning of the child, checking on her often, ensuring she never strained or skipped rest. His concern had become a constant presence, gentle yet unwavering. Outside, the wind began to shift. Leaves rustled in sharp bursts, tapping faintly against the windows. Samuel lifted his head, listening. "There's a storm coming," he murmured. Emma rose and looked outside. Dark clouds gathered in the distance, rolling across the sky with unusual speed. A low rumble vibrated through the air, and the breeze carried the smell of rain long before the first drop fell. Mrs. Lorne appeared in the doorway. "We're securing the shutters now," she said. "Best to prepare. It'll be a strong one." Samuel closed his ledger, his expression tightening. "Ensure everyone has shelter." "Yes, sir." As she left, a sudden sharp ache pulsed through Emma's abdomen. She placed a hand against her side, her breath catching in surprise. Samuel noticed immediately. "What is it?" I'm not sure. A pain. Brief, but stronger than usual." He set the ledger aside and stood, steadying himself with the arm of the chair. "Sit," he said quietly. "Let me call for the doctor." "It may be nothing," she insisted, though fear prickled beneath her skin. But then another wave hit, sharper, deeper, and she gripped the table's edge to remain upright. Her breath came in a tight gasp. Samuel's face drained of color. He stepped into the hallway and called for help, his voice strained. Within moments, Mrs. Lorne rushed in, followed by two servants. "She's in labor," Samuel said. "It's early, but it's begun." The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters as rain struck the windows in fierce, uneven bursts. The storm had arrived fully now, its roar blending with the rising tension inside the house. They helped Emma to the bedroom prepared for her, laying her gently on the bed. Dr. Hale was sent for immediately, though the worsening weather raised doubt about how quickly he could arrive. Samuel stood near the doorway, gripping the frame with one trembling hand. His breaths were shallow, his face drawn tight, but he refused to leave. Emma clutched the blanket as another contraction tore through her. Her voice broke in a low cry, and Samuel stepped forward instinctively. "I'm here," he whispered. She reached for him, her fingers closing around his trembling hand. His touch was warm, but she felt the weakness beneath it. Despite his illness, despite the fading strength she had witnessed night after night, he stood beside her now with a determination that humbled her. Minutes passed in painful waves, each stronger than the last. The room flickered with the dim glow of lanterns as the storm thundered beyond the walls. The wind shook the house, the rain slashing against the windows in wild bursts. Time blurred. Emma's breaths came ragged, her body trembling. Sweat dampened her hairline as she struggled through each contraction. Mrs. Lorne supported her, offering murmured reassurances, while the young maid fetched towels with trembling hands. Samuel remained at her side, though his face had grown alarmingly pale. At one point, he leaned heavily against the headboard, his breath catching in his throat. Emma looked up at him, worry striking through her even amid her pain. "Samuel, sit," she tried to say, but the words dissolved into another cry. He shook his head weakly. "I won't leave you." The storm raged on, lightning flashing beyond the shuttered windows. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of hooves approached, the doctor fighting his way through the storm. Dr. Hale entered moments later, soaked and breathless. He quickly assessed the situation, his calm demeanor offering a small anchor in the chaos. "The child is coming soon," he said. "Stay strong, Emma. You're doing well." But even as he spoke, Samuel's knees buckled. He caught himself on the edge of a table, his breath sharp, pained. Emma's heart clenched. "Samuel," she whispered through clenched teeth. "Please, rest." He sank onto a chair, one hand pressed hard against his chest. Dr. Hale shot him a swift, concerned glance, but could not leave Emma's side to attend him. The storm roared louder. Emma cried out again as a powerful contraction overtook her. Dr. Hale guided her through it with firm encouragement. When the next wave came, she pushed with every fragment of strength she possessed, tears streaming down her cheeks. And then, through the storm, through the cries, through the trembling air, a new sound emerged. A sharp, fragile cry. The baby's first breath. Dr. Hale lifted the tiny child, wiping him gently before placing him against Emma's chest. "A boy," he announced softly. "Healthy." Emma let out a sob, half from relief, half from overwhelming emotion. She cradled the newborn carefully, his warmth seeping into her trembling arms. For a moment the world quieted around her. Even the storm seemed to retreat into a distant hum. "Samuel," she whispered, turning toward him. "He's here." Samuel struggled to rise. He took 2 steps before his strength gave out completely, and he sank onto the edge of the bed. Emma shifted to give him space. He looked at their son with eyes that shone with a fragile, reverent light. "May I?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Emma guided the child gently into his arms. Samuel held his son as though he feared his touch might break him. His hands trembled, yet there was unmistakable wonder in his gaze. He brushed one finger along the baby's cheek, his breath catching with emotion so deep it seemed to shake his entire being. "You are perfect," he murmured. "My son." Emma felt tears well anew, but even as Samuel gazed at the child, his breath faltered. His shoulders slumped slightly and his head dipped as though too heavy to lift. Emma saw the change immediately, the sudden slackening of strength. "Samuel?" she whispered, fear piercing her. He looked at her, offering a faint, tender smile, the kind he had never shown before. "Thank you," he breathed, "for giving me this moment." His eyes softened, lingering on the child one last time before closing gently. His hand slipped. The room fell silent except for the storm's fading rumble and the newborn's soft whimper. Emma reached for Samuel's hand, gripping it tightly as though warmth might return if she held on long enough, but it did not. Samuel Carter, whose life had been shaped by loss and guarded by solitude, slipped away quietly beside the child he had longed for, the child he had lived just long enough to meet. Emma bent over him, her tears falling silently onto his still hand. Outside, the storm began to drift into distance. Inside, life and death had crossed paths in one fragile, unforgettable moment. The house felt unbearably still in the days that followed the storm. Though the wind had long calmed and the land lay quiet beneath the soft light of early spring, an unspoken heaviness lingered through every hallway. Emma moved gently through each room, her son cradled close to her heart, as though afraid that any sound might disturb the memory of the man she had lost. Samuel's funeral was small and dignified. The pastor from the settlement led a simple service beneath the large oak that overlooked the pastures he had tended for years. The ranch hands stood in silence, hats in hand, their expressions somber. Mrs. Lorne wept quietly. Even the animals seemed subdued, their movements slow as though they too felt the absence of the man who had kept the land steady. Emma held Elias tightly as she listened to the pastor's words. The newborn slept peacefully against her chest, unaware of the grief that surrounded him. She remained composed, though her eyes glistened with tears she seldom allowed to fall. When the pastor invited her to say a few words, she stepped forward with uncertain steps, unsure how to speak for a man whose life had been shaped by both tragedy and strength. She rested her palm against the wooden casket. "He protected what mattered," she said softly, even when it cost him more than anyone knew. It was all she could manage, but it was enough. After the burial, the lawyer, Mr. Green, requested her presence in the study. She sat across from him, Elias sleeping in her arms while he explained the details of Samuel's final will. Every asset, every acre of land, every share in his business holdings had been left to her as guardian for Elias. The transition of authority would occur immediately. "Mr. Carter left clear instructions," Mr. Green said, his voice steady. "He trusted you to uphold his intentions. The ranch is now under your care until your son reaches the age of majority." Emma listened, stunned by the magnitude of what Samuel had entrusted to her. She had never imagined herself carrying such responsibility, yet she felt an unexpected steadiness grow within her. She had survived hardship before. She would survive this as well, for Elias, for Ben, and for the memory of the man who had believed she was capable. In the weeks that followed, she learned the inner workings of the ranch. With patience and humility, she met with the foreman, reviewed accounts, and listened to suggestions from those who had worked the land for decades. The workers respected her for her gentleness, for the dignity with which she accepted their guidance, and for the impressive resolve she demonstrated despite her grief. Ben, now under better care and with access to the medicine he desperately needed, began to recover. His color returned gradually, and his strength trickled back day by day. When he first held Elias, he cried quietly, overwhelmed by the fragile new life resting in his arms. Months turned into years. The ranch flourished under Emma's steady leadership. She invested in repairs, ensured fair wages, and created living quarters for families who had once struggled to find shelter. The workers' trust in her grew strong and unshakable. Elias, meanwhile, grew into a bright and curious child. From his earliest days, he followed Emma through the house, tugging at her skirts, babbling as she worked. He had Samuel's dark eyes, calm, thoughtful, and steady, but Emma's gentle warmth shone through in everything he did. On quiet evenings, Emma walked to the oak tree where Samuel rested. She carried Elias with her, telling him stories of his father, not polished tales, but simple truths. Samuel's kindness, his strength, the way he listened, the way he softened when he learned he would be a father. She wanted Elias to grow up knowing not just the land he would inherit, but the heart that had once guided it. As the boy grew older, he became fond of wandering the library that had once been Samuel's refuge. He read eagerly, his small fingers tracing words with a fascination that reminded Emma of the first moment she had sat in that same room, overwhelmed but determined to learn. Elias learned to ride early, spent afternoons with the workers, and often sat under the oak tree, quietly studying the land as though feeling a connection he could not yet explain. Years passed gently. Ben thrived, healthy, cheerful, eager to help with chores around the ranch. The household warmed with laughter that had not existed before, filling halls that once echoed with only the soft steps of servants and the lonely silence of Samuel's grief. Emma, though touched by sadness each time she passed the study where Samuel had spent so much of his life, found a growing peace within herself. The weight of her sacrifice had transformed into a life of purpose. What began as necessity had become a calling, a quiet stewardship of the legacy Samuel left behind. By the time Elias reached his 10th year, he had already shown an uncommon sensitivity to the struggles of those around him. He sat with workers during their breaks, asked questions about their families, and even tried to help in small ways, fetching water, carrying tools, or comforting a homesick child from one of the workers' families. The men and women adored him, calling him the little master with a gentle heart. One evening, after returning from a visit to the cattle pens, Elias asked Emma, "Will I be like father one day?" Emma paused, her heart tightening with a familiar ache. "You will be yourself," she said softly, "but you will carry what was good in him." "And what was good in him?" Elias asked. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. His courage, his tenderness, and the way he tried every day to make life better for those who depended on him. Elias considered this carefully, then nodded with a seriousness beyond his years. When he reached adolescence, he began to study the ranch's operations more closely. Emma introduced him to Mr. Green, who taught him about contracts and property law. Elias absorbed the knowledge eagerly, driven by a deep desire to understand the responsibilities he would one day hold. He grew tall and strong, with a quiet confidence that reminded everyone of Samuel. Yet he carried Emma's compassion in equal measure, a balance that made him beloved across the ranch and among neighboring landowners. On the eve of his 15th birthday, Elias asked Emma if she would walk with him to Samuel's grave. She agreed, her heart swelling with both pride and longing. They stood beneath the broad oak, the leaves whispering softly in the wind. Elias knelt down, placing a small carved figure, a wooden horse he had shaped himself, beside the headstone. "I hope he would be proud of me," Elias said quietly. Emma rested a hand on his shoulder. "He would be," she whispered. "More than you know." He looked at her with calm determination. "Then I'll spend my life trying to honor what he began." As they walked back to the house, the setting sun cast long shadows over the fields. Emma felt a gentle, steady warmth settle in her chest, the kind that only comes when a long, painful road finally ends in a place of peace. She had entered the Carter Ranch as a woman desperate to save her brother. She had stayed because duty bound her. She had endured heartbreak, loneliness, and fear. But she had also built a life, one shaped by compassion, strengthened by struggle, and softened by love in its quietest, most unexpected forms. Emma looked at Elias, walking tall beside her, and realized that Samuel's greatest gift had not been the land or the wealth he entrusted her with. It had been this child, this future, this quiet, enduring hope. She smiled, letting the evening wind lift the stray curls around her face, and felt, for the first time in many years, completely whole.